Welcome to In 10, where we take 10 minutes to ask journalists the questions. I'm Kamina Lyle from the Dart Centre Asia Pacific. We are a resource centre and global network of journalists, researchers and health professionals dedicated to improving media coverage of trauma, conflict and tragedy. The Dart Centre is a project of the Columbia University Journalism School and has been operating for over 20 years. In 10 is our podcast where we talk to news media folk about the craft of journalism. We want to know how our colleagues are taking care of themselves, their sources and their stories. To kick us off, we're delighted to have Stella Paul here with us today. Stella is a multi-award-winning journalist and reporter based in Hyderabad and dedicated to covering climate and development issues with a strong focus on telling the stories of those who have been silenced. She is a Dart Asia Pacific Fellow and has won many other awards, including the United Nations Media Award for reporting on gender issues and the International Women's Media Foundation's Courage in Journalism Award. Stella, it's so lovely to have you here with us today. Tell us a little bit about where you're joining us from.
Thank you, Kamina. I'm honored to be on this podcast today. I have logged in from Hyderabad, which is a city in the central south of India. It's an hour flight from Mumbai.
And tell me, what's it like where you are? Like, how is your life and your world as a journalist changed in the light of COVID-19?
Life is pretty much like thousands of our colleagues everywhere in the world and millions of people actually across the world. I returned from a reporting trip in Somalia and Djibouti on the 4th of March. And a few days, I think on the same day, India had its first ever coronavirus positive case. So I went straight into self-quarantine the day I came home. So practically it's been now, I've lost a bit of count of time, but yeah, so since 4th of March, I have been in self-isolation, and countrywide, India has been in lockdown since 22nd of March. So after 2 weeks of lockdown, now we are in the second round of it, which has been extended to 3rd of May, just to give it a bit of context.
Yeah, and I know that from your work as a journalist is really about going and finding people, as I mentioned in the intro, whose stories are not normally told. So they're people who are marginalised, who don't necessarily have access to technology. I imagine a lot of your work is actually literally being out on the ground, meeting and talking to people. How do you do this now?
So now I think everybody who is listening to this podcast, you are the people, if you are also like me, who are actually ground reporters and reporting on people, men, women, children living within the margins, then you will connect to this. I basically almost all the time travel for each story, because the people that I talk to are marginalized. Sometimes they're living in the forest, sometimes mostly in the remote regions, people in economically disadvantaged communities, people who are living in disaster areas. So these are the people who can't, they cannot be connected or they are not accessible on internet, or the mobile connectivity is almost, is either very poor or almost non-existent, which means that I physically have to travel to them if I want to get the story right. The second reason is because I have a strong gender focus. And a lot of time, my stories are usually centered around the personal stories, personal feelings of people. You cannot get those personal stories until you actually reach them and you sit down and you spend some quality time with them. Connecting is a very strong focus, very strong factor here. So none of this is possible to be done remotely. So having said that, I've been trying to reach out people on phone as much as possible, but what we call, telling a story with the utmost honesty and integrity, that has taken a backseat. So I have not been able to do much reporting. I have just published one story between 4th of March and now. So that will give a kind of an idea of how difficult it has been to, because I can't do a story that's not honest, that's not in depth, and that is run of the mill. So just to give an idea of how difficult.
And I guess that's affecting your income as well. Would that be right? Are you paid by the story, or are you in a role where you get paid regardless?
Yes, you got it right. Financial hardship is no longer a point we can even hide. Normally, I'm an independent journalist with a regular affiliation with Interpress Service, which means most of my reporting is done for IPS. Although sometimes I do work with others. I also work as a media trainer, and I especially train women journalists in investigative journalism with a gender focused area, gender focus. So in the past 3 weeks, I had to cancel. Actually, it got postponed till indefinitely. I had a training project in Bangladesh, which had to be postponed. I had another project in Nepal, which also had to be postponed. These are the projects that actually help us independent journalists keep going. So I can also, invest in the stories, including the travels. And the stories, the car story payment that I usually get has obviously been hit because I haven't been able to deliver. I do have, having said that, there is a big demand for stories right now, the kind of stories that I normally do, very personalized, in-depth investigative stories, but I can't travel. So there is a yeah.
This must just be so frustrating for you, because the stories are there, they exist, there must be so much to tell, and you're not able to tell it. I think also you're aware that many of your colleagues are not quite so disciplined as you in terms of the lockdown and the isolation. And how are you noticing that playing out amongst your colleagues in India?
Actually, because I'm an international journalist, I observe things from that perspective, and this is something that not just journalists in India undergoing. The pandemic is global, and the fallout, the negative results that we are seeing is also very global. So whatever a journalist like me is facing is the exact thing that my colleagues anywhere, whether they're in Colombia or in Cambodia or in the West, they're save a very, very few who are working for a very large, resourceful media networks. Almost everybody is right now feeling the crunch of not being able to give their best, not being able to be productive enough. And I think the most frustrating factor here is that this is how now, when we are so full of enthusiasm, we have the stories, we have the willingness to do it, we are dying would be, I think, the right word to say, just longing to go out there and tell these stories, but we are not able to do it. So this is where the frustration comes from. But I wouldn't like to be this all about doom and gloom. I think this is when it's also important that how we get a control, get a grip over the frustration that has been building up in us.
And how are you managing that frustration? How are you taking care of yourself? How are you navigating through this?
I think the first thing here is to be, to be safe. So the first thing is that, as I mentioned, there are demands for stories. A lot of networks are reaching out. Editors are willing to hear the pitches. But I could go out being a media person. The lockdown, there are exceptions, even in the lockdown for media persons to go out and do a story. But at the same time, you cannot put yourself in the physical danger. So this is when we have to take a call, like what is more important? Is it doing the story right now, or is it not doing the story, but being safe? So I would always say that being safe is the most important thing. Some of us are maybe courageous enough to put personal safety, not take personal safety not so seriously. And it happened to me. I was tempted to just go out, but then I thought of the people who are, we are in the families now that we are all staying home. We are not alone. We have either our family members, or our roommates, our other colleagues. So if not for myself, I have to be safe for other people. It's my social responsibility as well, besides being a responsible journalist. So I think the challenge here is, how do I balance this? How do I stay safe at the same time, not completely go unproductive, or not completely give into frustration, and stay positive as well? And the first thing you mentioned, Kimina, that I was, I'm an ex-fellow of the Dart Center. And I would say, I've said this many times before, and I would say again that being a Darts Fellow is something that it's great, not just because it's another destiny. There's so much different than just another fellowship. It's something that you learn that actually stays with you, and you can, whenever the time gets hard, you can actually draw something out of it. So to be clear, we learned one thing is, of course, how to take care of yourself. The second thing is, the value of peer network, which is like talking to your fellow journalists. And I think it's a great thing to do. It's very, very super useful during this hard time because the context is the same. Almost everybody is feeling what I'm feeling. Almost everybody is facing what I'm facing. So that builds a common ground for us. And I have been doing that, reaching out to my other journalist colleagues wherever they are. We have the blessing of the digital connectivity, and I've been using that like many other people. And I would suggest that every one of us, you too, do it. Whoever is listening to this podcast, please reach out to your colleagues wherever they are. It doesn't matter if they're not covering the same trauma and crisis journalism. Maybe they are from an entirely different, and they may be from, some of them are from smaller networks, and they miss this human connections even more now. So it's a great thing for us. It's a great thing for them, who get connected. So connecting with fellow journalists is one thing. The second thing I do is, of course, do a lot of reading a lot of, this time, a lot of studies and reports are coming out. And for us journalists, these are great resources. When we do get back to work, we may not have enough time to read them thoroughly. So this is what I've been doing a lot of reading a lot of reports and studies and surveys. Then take little notes to build my own database on COVID and coronavirus outbreak. What does that mean is, once this is over, there will be a lot of information overloading on the internet, but we journalists have to get back straight into work. Again, we will not have enough time to read, and sometimes we do need to know the chronological order of things that has happened. It's like knowing the history, having on your fingertip. So the great thing is that right now we have the time and opportunity to read the newspaper, watch TV, read digital journals, and take little notes of, okay, what are the biggest things that happened everywhere? The political big decisions, the economic big events, the historic fall of petrol prices, just to be, just one. And, the great human stories that happened. For example, some girl, the other day, she was walking back to her tribal village from Hyderabad city because her family just couldn't stay here. They were not getting enough food, so they walked. And the girl, just 1 hour from home, after walking for 3 days, she died. So these are great human stories that we read. These are like flashes that just come and go, little tickers on the TV screen. Great time to take note of them for future, in the future we can build up, do some follow-up stories. Do keep an eye on many grants and fellowship opportunities that are being announced right now. ICFJ and IWMS, for example, have announced new grant opportunities. So just to keep an eye on them, preparing your proposal and building your story ideas. I think these will keep you very positive and, totally in your elements, and to really help you to stay away from the frustration that is so inevitable otherwise. So stay safe.
You haven't said it in so many words, but listening to you, what I hear is one of the things that we teach at the Dart Centre, which is to stay connected with your personal mission as to why you are a journalist, is one of the ways to build resilience against, adversity and trauma and what have you. And you're just the most extraordinary, shining example of that. And thank you so much for joining us today. It's been an absolute pleasure to have you.
Thank you. It's my pleasure. We shot out the time, but you can imagine that this is what happens when you stay in isolation for a long time. So I hope that we will connect again. And thank you, Dart Center, again for this very, very, very timely initiative.
What is time these days anyway? It's all warped. All right, Stella, thanks again. And you take care and do keep staying connected.
You too, stay safe.
Okay, bye.